Usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, like especially a physical one, there is this deep comfort in precision.
Oh, absolutely.
Like think about breaking your arm. You go to the hospital, they put you in a machine, the x-ray prints out, and boom, there it is.
Right, a jagged white line on a black background.
Exactly. The doctor points at it.
Yeah.
And it is entirely binary. It's broken or it's not broken. You can see it, you can categorize it, and you know exactly what needs to be fixed.
And that provides such an immediate sense of control. I mean, human beings are deeply wired to seek out visual, tangible evidence for why we are in pain.
Yeah, we need to see it.
We really do. If we can point to it, we feel like we can manage it.
But then you step out of the physical realm and into the world of the mind. You step into the territory of deep psychological burnout or, that creeping resentment in your relationships. Just this heavy exhaustion that so many of us feel at the end of the week.
Yeah, that Friday afternoon wall.
Right. And suddenly, that medical x-ray machine is completely useless. I mean, you can't put a fractured ego or a burned-out spirit on a light box.
No, you really can't.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. The pain is intensely real, of course, but the source is totally invisible to our conventional tools.
So what do we do?
Well, we try to treat it by changing our external circumstances. We get a new job, or we buy something, or, we go on vacation.
Yeah, the classic escape.
Exactly. But the underlying fracture remains completely untouched.
But what if there actually was an X-ray for the human mind?
Now, that is a fascinating question.
Right. Not a machine built of plastic and wires, but a text. An ancient, radically uncompromising philosophical text that cuts right through those murky waters of human suffering straight to the bone.
I love that framing.
Welcome to our 5th deep dive in this special series. Today, we are taking you into the profound, timeless wisdom of the Diamond Sutra.
It's going to be quite the journey.
It really is. Specifically, we are exploring chapters 11 through 16 today. And we are looking at a text that essentially operates as a cognitive scan for your mind.
It really strips away all those superficial layers we build up.
Yeah, all the layers around our identities and our struggles. It forces us to look at the actual architecture of our pain.
The Diamond Sutra is arguably one of the most surgical documents ever written regarding human psychology.
Surgical is a great word for it.
It really doesn't deal in comfortable platitudes at all. It is designed to aggressively dismantle the illusions that cause us to suffer.
And the section we are analyzing today sets up a philosophical showdown. It fundamentally redefines what it means to be successful, what it means to be wealthy, and honestly, what it means to actually help another human being.
Yes, we are looking at the ultimate heavyweight contest here.
The big one. Material fortune, which the text calls feud, versus spiritual merit, which is called gandhi.
Feud versus gandhi.
Right. And to set the stage for this, the source text offers a thought experiment that is so massive in scale, it almost defies human comprehension.
It's dizzying when you really think about the math.
It really is. The Buddha claims that understanding and sharing just a simple 4-line stanza of philosophical truth generates more value than owning and giving away entire galaxies filled with solid gold and diamonds.
Which just sounds absurd at first glance.
Totally absurd.
It sounds like pure hyperbole. But what we're going to do today is unpack the exact literal mechanics of why that statement is psychologically and philosophically true.
And we aren't going to do this as some dry, dusty history lesson.
Definitely not. We are going to seamlessly blend classical Buddhist logic with modern mindfulness.
Specifically drawing on the clinical work of Jon Kabat-Zinn, right?
Exactly. We'll use his work to see how this ancient sutra offers a direct, highly practical antidote to modern struggles. Things like workplace burnout and appearance anxiety.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump straight into this setup. Because Chapter 11 of the Sutra establishes a scale that makes the wealth of modern billionaires look completely, utterly insignificant.
Insignificant is putting it mildly.
Right. So the text asks you, the listener, to imagine taking the 7 treasures. That's gold, silver, lapis lazuli, agate, coral, pearls, and so on.
The ultimate valuables of the ancient world.
Yeah. And taking all of that and filling up what ancient Indian cosmology called a 3,000 worlds.
And just to give you a sense of that scale, ancient cosmology didn't just stop at one world.
No, they went big.
Very big. A great thousand world is essentially a multiverse concept. Imagine 1,000 solar systems.
Okay, 1,000 solar systems.
Then multiply that by 1,000, and then multiply that result by 1,000 again.
Wow.
You're talking about a physical expanse of billions of worlds. It's a scale so large, it basically exhausts the human imagination.
But the thought experiment actually goes further than that.
Oh, it pushes it to the absolute limit.
The Buddha says, take that entire infinite multiverse and fill every single inch of it with solid gold and diamonds.
Just packed to the brim.
Right. Then go to the banks of the Ganges River. Pick up a single handful of sand.
Which is incredibly fine sand, by the way.
Yeah, so there are millions of tiny grains in that one handful alone. Now look at the entire river. The Buddha says, multiply your multiverse of diamonds by the number of grains of sand in the entire Ganges.
And the people listening to him at the time lived near that river. They knew the texture of that sand perfectly well.
So they knew exactly what he was implying.
Exactly. He is mathematically describing a number of universes that surpasses modern astronomical calculations.
It's just staggering.
He is aggressively pushing the human mind to its absolute conceptual limit of material accumulation.
Let me translate this for you into a more modern framing. Imagine you aren't just a trillionaire. You are a cosmic entity.
A galactic CEO.
Exactly. You own billions of galaxies, and every single planet in those galaxies is composed of flawless, solid diamonds. You possess the ultimate, absolute peak of material wealth.
Nothing more could possibly be owned.
Right. And then you decide to give it all away to charity.
Every last diamond.
Every single one. It is the ultimate act of philanthropy. You literally solve all material poverty in the universe forever.
Now, the merit generated from that unimaginable act of giving would logically seem infinite.
You would absolutely think so. I mean, how could it not be? But here is the shocking conclusion the text delivers.
This is the turning point.
The Buddha states that the merit of this galaxy-spanning material charity is fundamentally inferior to the merit of a person who fully grasps and explains to others just 4 lines of the Diamond Sutra.
4 lines of text.
4 lines. 4 lines of text versus universes of diamonds. I have to be honest, I struggled with this initially.
Most people do. It feels deeply counterintuitive.
How is that logically possible?
Yeah.
How can words beat out the actual physical eradication of poverty?
Well, to understand the mechanics of this, we have to look at the deep analysis provided in our sources regarding those 2 critical concepts we mentioned earlier.
Feud and Gongdae.
Exactly. Material fortune versus spiritual merit. Let's examine feud first.
Okay, let's do it.
The text described feud as being, leaky.
Leaky.
Yes, it has flaws. It represents finite worldly blessings. It is strictly bound by the laws of karma and cause and effect.
Let's ground that a bit. When you say leaky, do you mean it's sort of like a battery that slowly loses its charge over time?
That is a highly accurate way to look at it, actually.
Yeah.
Feud operates entirely within a transactional system.
A transaction.
Right. You perform a good deed, you give away a diamond, you build a hospital, you help a neighbor out, and you generate a corresponding unit of positive energy or good karma.
Like putting a deposit in the bank.
Precisely. But because it operates within the realm of time and cause and effect, it is ultimately exhaustible. It is a bank account, plain and simple.
So even if I have a bank account the size of a literal galaxy because I gave away all those diamonds, I am still spending from it.
Yes, exactly. You will absolutely enjoy the fruits of that massive good deed.
I'd hope so.
Oh, you would. Perhaps you experience immense luxury, perfect health, and high status for many lifetimes, but you are constantly withdrawing from that account every day you experience those blessings.
The balance is always going down.
Always. And one day, whether it takes a year or 10,000 millennia, the account of that specific karma will hit 0.
And then what?
Well, when it does, the underlying ignorance and suffering of the human condition will still be right there waiting for you.
Wow. So it doesn't actually solve the core problem of existence at all. It just makes the waiting room a lot more comfortable.
That's a great way to phrase it. The classical analogy often used is that feud is a golden cage.
A golden cage.
Right. It might be beautifully decorated, and you might be fed the finest foods imaginable, but you are still trapped within the cycle of worldly suffering.
Or still a prisoner.
Yes. You are still subject to anxiety, to loss, to the inevitable fear of the cage door opening.
Which brings us to Gongdae, or spiritual merit. How does the text differentiate this from the golden cage?
Well, unlike feud, Gongdae is described as leak-proof.
Leak-proof.
Yes, it does not drain away.
Why not?
Because Gongdae isn't an external reward you get for completing a transaction. It isn't a currency you earn and spend. Gongdae represents internal awakening.
So it's not a bank account at all.
Not at all. It is the fundamental realization of the true nature of reality. It permanently alters the structure of the mind itself.
You know, our sources point out a really interesting translation detail here. Some early translators just called both of these things a heap of merit.
Which is incredibly confusing.
Very confusing. But the deeper commentary tradition parses out the actual quality of that merit. It's not just about accumulating more stuff. It's about fundamentally changing the state of the person doing the accumulating.
Exactly. The difference is qualitative, not quantitative. To use a very grounded, familiar proverb, it is the exact difference between giving someone a fish and teaching them how to fish.
Let's break that down, because it perfectly illustrates this whole diamond paradox we've been talking about.
It really does.
So, material charity, giving away the galaxies of diamonds, is giving humanity a fish.
Yes.
And it is absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, the Sutra isn't saying we shouldn't feed people or help people, right? It relieves immediate, acute physical suffering.
Absolutely. It is a deeply compassionate act. But it doesn't cure the root cause of why the person was hungry in the first place.
Because the hunger will eventually return.
Inevitably. The diamonds will eventually be spent or lost or stolen. Dharma charity, however, which is the act of sharing the wisdom of those 4 lines of the Sutra, is teaching humanity how to fish.
It's the permanent fix.
Exactly. Wisdom permanently cures the root of suffering by removing the fundamental ignorance that causes us to experience psychological pain to begin with.
So the 4 lines of text are infinitely more valuable, because the diamonds merely decorate the bars of the golden cage, while the 4 lines of text provide the actual key to unlock the door and walk out.
That captures the essence perfectly. Wisdom transcends the entire transactional economy of the universe.
Okay, but looking at this practically for a second, if I'm not a billionaire giving away diamonds, how does this distinction actually matter in my normal Tuesday to Friday life?
It matters deeply in our everyday interactions.
Like, how does giving away fish actually create suffering for the giver? This leads us into a deep dive on how the Sutra gets incredibly surgical about our modern egos and how we actually actively ruin our own good deeds.
It is perhaps the most urgently practical application of this entire philosophy. We really need to examine the psychological mechanics of burnout here.
I want you to think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever bent over backwards for your company?
Oh, we all have.
Right. You stayed late, you took on extra projects that definitely weren't in your job description, or maybe you've done it in a personal relationship.
Very common.
You gave and gave, you listened, you supported, you compromised on everything, and instead of feeling this warm glow of satisfaction, you ended up feeling utterly exhausted, deeply resentful, and totally underappreciated.
Yes. That is the clinical presentation of modern burnout.
It's awful.
It's an epidemic of emotional exhaustion. And the fascinating thing is, the Diamond Sutra diagnosed the exact architectural flaw that causes this burnout centuries ago.
It's amazing how timeless it is.
Truly. The sources outline 3 specific types of giving from the text to help us map this out.
Walk us through those 3 types of charity. Let's get the terminology down.
Okay, first, there is the charity of wealth. This is straightforward. Giving money, material goods, your time, or your physical energy.
Okay, the tangible stuff.
Right. Second is the charity of fearlessness or security. This means providing emotional support, protecting someone from harm, or creating a safe psychological space for a friend who is in crisis.
Being a shoulder to cry on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And third is Dharma charity, which we just discussed, sharing liberating wisdom.
So when we are burning out at work or burning out in our personal lives, we are almost always engaging in the first 2.
Almost exclusively.
We're giving our time, our physical energy, and our emotional support. We are genuinely trying to do good things. So why does the act of giving actually hurt us? Where does that bitter resentment come from?
Well, the sources point to a critical flaw in how our minds are conditioned to operate. The Sutra calls this flaw attached giving.
Attached giving.
Yes, it means we are giving with an attachment to forms.
Attachment to forms.
Yeah.
Let's really spend some time exploring how that mechanism actually works in the brain. What does that mean on a practical level?
When we give with attachment, we are implicitly demanding a transaction, even if we are entirely unconscious of it at the time.
We expect something back.
Always. We are trapped by what the Sutra calls the 4 marks. These are the illusions of an independent ego, a separate person, a distinct being, and a continuous life.
Okay, if I translate that into the inner monologue of an average person, it basically breaks down to a deeply ingrained psychological script, right?
Let's hear it.
It's like I, which is my ego, gave this specific thing to you, which is the other person. Therefore, because I did this for you, you owe me.
That is the exact mechanism. Spot on. And the transaction doesn't have to be monetary at all.
No, the emotional ones are the worst.
In fact, the most dangerous transactions are the emotional ones. When we say to someone, hey, no strings attached, there is almost always an invisible string woven right into the fabric of the gift.
Let's trace the steps of that invisible string in a workplace scenario.
Good idea.
Let's say I work straight through the weekend on a presentation to help my team out. I tell myself, I'm just being a good team player.
A classic rationalization.
But then Monday morning rolls around, and my boss doesn't acknowledge it. My coworkers don't throw me a parade in the break room. Suddenly, I am absolutely furious. I feel completely invisible.
Right, because your underlying unspoken script was, I sacrificed my weekend, so my boss better recognize my effort with public validation or a future promotion.
I wanted the parade.
Exactly. The invisible string was a demand for reciprocal loyalty and praise.
Or think about it in a friendship. I listened to a friend complain about their terrible relationship for 3 hours on a Tuesday night.
That's the charity of security.
Right. But then, 2 weeks later, I've had a bad day and I need to vent, and they say they're too busy to talk. The resentment I feel in that moment isn't just disappointment. It's a feeling of being literally robbed.
Yes, because you secretly viewed those 3 hours of listening as currency.
Exactly. I was depositing it into a relational bank account, and now they're refusing my withdrawal.
And when that invisible transaction isn't honored by the other person, usually because they have absolutely no idea the invisible string even exists, we feel intensely cheated.
We feel victimized.
Our ego is depleted because the expected return on investment never materialized. That depletion, compounded over months or years, is exactly what we call burnout.
The sources share a brilliant analogy from Master Nanawai Chin that illustrates the absurdity of this attached giving perfectly. It is so relatable.
It's one of my favorites.
He says, imagine it is the middle of a freezing, bitter winter. You see someone shivering on the street, so you give them a thick, beautiful, incredibly warm sweater.
A very kind gesture.
They put it on, they instantly feel the warmth, and they look at you with tears in their eyes. They bless you. You are an absolute savior.
And in that specific context, it is a perfect act of charity. It perfectly meets an immediate condition.
Right. But then, Master Nan says, imagine you take that exact same beautiful, expensive sweater and you force someone to wear it in the middle of a blazing 100-degree summer day.
Oh, that would be torture.
They are sweating, they are miserable, they are completely overheating.
Well,
If you make them wear it, they won't bless you at all. They will resent you intensely. They'll probably want to hit you.
this analogy reveals a really profound truth about reality according to the Sutra. Blessings, gifts, and all material objects have absolutely no fixed permanent nature.
They don't mean anything on their own.
Right. They are empty of inherent value.
So the sweater itself isn't inherently good or bad.
No.
It doesn't contain, like, a permanent microscopic particle of helpfulness.
Exactly. The value of the gift is entirely dependent on the intersecting conditions of the moment.
The context.
The context, the timing, the specific needs of the receiver. It has nothing to do with the physical object itself. But when we practice attached giving, our ego gets completely obsessed with the sweater.
We think, hey, I gave you a $200 cashmere sweater. I gave you 3 hours of my Tuesday night. I worked the entire weekend. You must be grateful to me.
Yes, we demand gratitude.
And we completely ignore the fact that it might be summer in their life and they don't need or want a sweater. Or maybe they never actually asked us to work the weekend in the first place.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, our ego literally blinds us to the reality of the other person. We give to satisfy our own internal narrative of being a good, generous person, rather than to actually alleviate the other person's suffering.
We're just starring in our own movie.
Exactly. We are demanding that reality conform to the shape of our gift.
So our ego is essentially colonizing the other person's experience. That is a really heavy realization.
It is uncomfortable to admit.
Very. So if that is the disease, what is the antidote? How do we actually untrain our brains from this exhausting transactional loop?
The Buddha proposes a radical shift in perspective here. The solution is unattached charity, which the philosophical tradition conceptualizes as the emptiness of the three spheres.
The emptiness of the three spheres. Okay, what are the three spheres we need to empty out?
The three spheres are the giver, the receiver, and the gift.
Okay.
When practicing true unattached giving, one must realize that inherently, in the ultimate sense, there is no solid, permanent I who is giving, there is no solid you who is receiving, and there is no fixed gift being transferred.
Okay, I'm going to need you to ground that for me.
I know, it sounds abstract.
Because if I am sitting here at my desk and my coworker is sitting right there and I hand them a file to help them with a project, that file is a real physical object. I am a real person. They are a real person. To say it's all empty sounds like, I don't know, philosophical wordplay.
It feels incredibly solid on the conventional, everyday level, absolutely. But let's look at the mechanism of how this emptiness actually functions in practice.
Okay, let's break it down.
On the level of ultimate reality, your ego, the I that you think is so permanent and solid, is really just a temporary collection of causes, conditions, moods, memories, and biological states.
That's only shifting.
Right. And the receiver is the exact same kind of fluid temporary collection.
So when I drop the rigid boundaries of my ego, what actually happens to the action itself?
When you achieve the emptiness of the three spheres, you simply act because the action is required by the reality of the present moment.
You just do what's needed.
Yes. You give the sweater in the winter simply because the winter's cold and a body is shivering. You don't give it because you want to be remembered forever as the wonderful person who gave the sweater.
Let's trace the mental steps of that. If I help my coworker with the file, and I'm practicing this emptiness, my internal monologue isn't, I am helping them so they owe me a favor next week.
No, not at all.
My internal state is just, the file needs to be completed, the project requires it, I have the capacity right now. So the action happens.
Yes. The action flows right through you without getting caught on the hook of your identity. You give without any egoic attachment to the result.
You sever the invisible string before the gift even leaves your hands.
Beautifully said. You sever the string.
And the mechanism for curing burnout here is fascinating, right? If there is no I demanding a return on investment, there can be no resentment when the return doesn't arrive.
Exactly. Burnout becomes mathematically impossible because there is no egoic bank account to be depleted in the first place.
You cannot drain a reservoir that doesn't exist.
That's the secret. When you remove the ego from the transaction, you suddenly have infinite energy for the action itself.
I see the profound logic in that. I really do. But I have to push back here because this brings up a huge existential dilemma for a lot of people.
I think I know where you're going with this.
If I train myself to drop my ego, if I realize there is no me and no you, and I follow the Sutra's directive to just cling to nothing, doesn't that just turn me into a passive, apathetic zombie?
The zombie critique.
Yeah. I mean, if I shouldn't be attached to the outcome of my work, why should I even get out of bed in the morning? Why should I care if the team project succeeds or fails?
That is the most common and, frankly, arguably the most vital critique of this entire philosophy.
It's a real concern.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
To a mind raised in a highly goal-oriented capitalist society, clinging to nothing sounds completely identical to nihilism.
It sounds like giving up.
Right, but it is the exact opposite of giving up.
Yeah.
And to understand why, our sources bridge this ancient text with a major pillar of modern psychology.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's bring in mindfulness.
Let's do it.
The core verse of the Diamond Sutra, the specific phrase that famously triggered the sudden enlightenment of the great Zen patriarch Huineng, is this: develop a mind that clings to nothing.
Or, depending on the translation, awaken the mind without fixing it anywhere.
Without fixing it anywhere. It is a directive to achieve a state of fluid, frictionless, unattached awareness.
Exactly. And our sources weave this ancient directive together with a modern classic, Jon Kabat-Zinn's book, Wherever You Go, There You Are.
Such a great book. For those who might not know, Kabat-Zinn is the pioneer who essentially brought mindfulness into mainstream Western clinical medicine.
Right, with his mindfulness-based stress reduction program, or MBSR.
He achieved something totally remarkable. He took the functional, psychological essence of Buddhist meditation, and he stripped away all the cultural and religious dogma.
He distilled it.
He created a clinical tool to help regular patients deal with severe chronic pain, stress, and terminal illness.
And the sources use Kabat-Zinn's work as a bridge to explain what clinging to nothing actually looks like in a modern, highly active life.
So how does he define mindfulness clinically?
Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally.
Let's really focus on that last word,
Yeah.
non-judgmentally. That maps perfectly onto dropping the attachment to forms we were just discussing.
It is the exact same mechanism. When you judge an experience, you are attaching a rigid form to it.
You're boxing it in.
You are applying a label. You say, this is good, this is bad, this is mine, this is theirs, this means I am successful, this means I am a total failure.
We do that all day long.
Non-stop. Mindfulness asks you to drop that heavy narrative overlay. It asks you to silence the ego's endless commentary track and just observe the raw, unfiltered reality of the present moment.
But my pushback still remains. Observing raw reality is great for a silent meditation retreat in the woods. But in the modern workplace, we have to do things. We have hard deadlines, we have to hit quarterly targets, we have mortgages to pay.
Life is demanding.
Exactly. How can a normal person practice clinging to nothing while actively participating in a highly demanding, outcome-driven environment? I can't just look at my boss and say, sorry, the Q3 report isn't done, Susan. I was developing a mind that clings to nothing.
No, you certainly cannot do that. And doing so would be a profound misunderstanding of the Sutra anyway.
Okay, good to know.
The Buddha himself was not passive. He spent 45 years walking back and forth across India, managing a massive, complex monastic community, and engaging in constant, rigorous debate.
He was a very busy guy.
Very busy. This is where Kabat-Zinn's specific concept of non-doing becomes the crucial key here. Non-doing is not doing nothing. It is not passivity or laziness.
Okay, so how do you define non-doing in action?
Non-doing is action born of deep, present awareness rather than egoic grasping.
Can you give me an example?
Think of an elite athlete in the zone, or a master musician deeply lost in a complex performance. They are engaged in incredibly difficult high-stakes activities.
Sweating, working hard.
Right, but in that moment of peak flow, there is no ego present. The musician isn't thinking, gee, I hope the critics in the front row like this, or I wonder if my posture looks cool right now.
They're not in their head.
The I vanishes completely. There is only the music, there is only the action. That is non-doing in action.
Ah, okay, I see. So the intense effort is happening, the massive skill is being applied, but the anxiety about the result of the action is entirely absent.
Yes, you fully experience the present moment of the work without the heavy, distorting filter of the ego worrying about the future.
So, applied to my workplace dilemma with the Q3 report.
It means you do your job with absolute dedication. You write that quarterly report with intense focus, intelligence, and care. But you leave the stress of the outcome, the desperate need for the promotion, the fear of your boss's critique, the anxiety of failure. You leave all of that at the door.
You are deeply attached to the doing of the work, but you are not attached to the form of the result.
There is a famous quote from Kabat-Zinn highlighted in our sources that nails this. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf.
I love that quote.
The waves are the inevitable realities of life. The deadlines, the demands, the economic pressures, the difficult people you have to deal with.
And the ego's usual response is to try to build a massive, thick, concrete wall to stop all those waves. We try to control absolutely everything so we don't feel any anxiety.
Which is exhausting.
It's impossible. And eventually a wave always breaks the wall anyway.
Exactly. Non-doing is recognizing the complete futility of the concrete wall and grabbing a surfboard instead.
Surfing is a highly active state.
Highly active, physically demanding. You are balancing, you are moving, you are constantly making micro-adjustments, but you are flowing with the reality of the wave, not fighting against it.
And returning to the text, that is exactly what it means to develop a mind that clings to nothing. I mean, the surfer's mind cannot cling to the wave they rode 10 seconds ago, or they will lose their balance and crash. They cannot obsess over the wave that might come in 5 minutes, or they will crash.
They have to be right there.
They must be entirely fluid, clinging to absolutely nothing but the immediate reality of the water beneath them.
And that level of presence is the ultimate operational efficiency. You engage deeply with the world, but you decouple your internal psychological peace from the external, uncontrollable outcomes.
That reframes the entire concept of work and effort. The burnout we discussed earlier wasn't coming from the physical typing on the keyboard or the act of sitting in meetings.
No, the physical work is rarely the main issue.
The burnout was generated by the immense friction of the ego, constantly demanding that the world behave exactly the way the ego wants it to.
When you drop the demand, you drop the friction. And when you drop the friction, the exhaustion simply disappears.
It is an incredibly powerful mechanism. But, dropping our attachment to our job performance or our bank accounts or our weekend favors, that's all still somewhat external.
True.
The Sutra doesn't stop there. It turns the camera inward to a much more uncomfortable place.
It goes right for the core.
Because the hardest thing for a human being to detach from isn't their job title or their money. It is their very own physical body.
Which brings us to the profound escalation in Chapter 15 of the Sutra. The thought experiments push even further past the edge of our comfort zones.
Yeah, we started with the trillionaire giving away galaxies of diamonds. Now the Buddha raises the stakes to the absolute ultimate limit.
He asks a terrifying question.
He asks, what if, instead of giving away external wealth, you sacrificed your own physical body and your own life?
For very existence.
And what if you performed this ultimate sacrifice as many times as there are grains of sand in the Ganges River?
It is the absolute conceptual limit of generosity. You are giving your life over and over and over again.
And yet, the Buddha's conclusion remains completely unyielding. He states that even that ultimate, unimaginable bodily sacrifice does not equal the spiritual merit of understanding and sharing the four-line stanza of the sutra.
It is meant to be a profoundly jarring statement. It forces the practitioner to confront the absolute primacy of formless wisdom over physical existence.
I want to pivot this extreme metaphor into a highly relatable modern context that our sources highlight. Because realistically, while most of us listening are not going to sacrifice our lives for charity today...
Hopefully not.
Right. But we are, in fact, sacrificing massive amounts of our time, our money, and our emotional energy obsessing over our physical forms. We need to talk about appearance anxiety.
It is a truly modern epidemic, and it's uniquely accelerated by the constant comparison engines of social media and ubiquitous advertising.
It's everywhere. We obsess over the aging process. We obsess over our weight, the texture of our skin, the thinning of our hair.
We scrutinize every pore.
We spend billions upon billions of dollars globally on serums, surgeries, brutal diets, and procedures, just desperately trying to freeze time. We are trying to force our physical bodies to conform to an impossible, completely static standard of beauty.
And according to the diagnostic framework of the Sutra, this entire enterprise is a recipe for guaranteed, inescapable suffering.
Because it's a losing battle.
Exactly. Why? Because as the text famously states, all appearances are illusory.
Let's examine the mechanics of that phrase, illusory. If I pinch my arm right now, it hurts. It feels very solid. It doesn't feel like a hologram or a dream.
It exists conventionally, yes. The Sutra is not denying basic physics. When it says the body is illusory, it means that the body is impermanent and lacks a fixed, unchanging essence.
It's constantly moving.
It is an ongoing process, not a static object. I mean, biologically, on a cellular level, your physical body today is entirely different from the body you inhabited 10 years ago.
Literally different cells.
And it will be entirely different 10 years from now.
It is a flowing river of biological material, not a carved marble statue.
Precisely. Appearance anxiety is generated because we falsely identify our true, permanent self with this temporary, rapidly decaying physical form.
We take a mental snapshot.
Yes. We take a snapshot of ourselves, perhaps how we looked at 25, or how an influencer looks with a heavy filter, and our ego demands that the universe hold that snapshot still forever. But the fundamental law of the universe is change.
So we are essentially declaring war on the law of entropy.
A war you cannot win.
Which is a war we will mathematically inevitably lose every single time.
And the chronic underlying stress of fighting that impossible war every single day is what causes our deep psychological suffering. We are holding onto the water as it flows right through our fingers, panicking as it slips away.
So what's the cure for that panic?
The Sutra offers a radical shift in perspective. It introduces the concept of the Deshen, or the great body.
The great body. You know, in a fitness-obsessed culture, that sounds like a marketing term for going to the gym and lifting weights. What does the text actually mean by it?
It is the exact opposite of the physical form. The great body refers to the Dharma body, or the Dharmakaya.
Okay.
This is our true nature. Unlike the physical body, the Dharma body is formless, boundless, and completely unconditioned by time or space. It is the pure, observing awareness that we discussed in the context of Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness.
Let me make sure I'm grasping this. My true self is not my face. It is not my job title, my gender, my bank account, or my receding hairline.
None of those things.
My true self is the invisible, quiet awareness that is merely observing my face age, observing my job change, and observing my bank account fluctuate.
That is the core realization. And Master Hishinyun, a highly prominent modern Buddhist thinker cited in our sources, points out a really fascinating psychological detail here.
What does he say?
He meets that the attachment to form is so deeply wired into us that even highly advanced practitioners, bodhisattvas, must work diligently to overcome subtle, microscopic attachments to their own identities.
So it's not something you just read in a book once and instantly achieve forever. The ego is incredibly sticky.
It is profoundly sticky. It takes deep practice. Master Xingyan says the goal is to attain what is called patient acquiescence in the uncreated.
That's a mouthful.
The Chinese term is wusheng faren. It is the ultimate profound patience of realizing that on the absolute level of the Dharma body, nothing is truly born and nothing truly dies.
Because it's all just shifting forms.
Because all physical forms are just temporary swirling arrangements of conditions.
Patient acquiescence. I really want to sit with that phrase for a second. It implies this deep, relaxing surrender.
It really does.
Instead of standing in front of the mirror every morning, fighting the aging process with intense anxiety and fear, you patiently acquiesce to the reality of change. You relax into it, knowing that your true nature, that observing awareness, is completely untouched by wrinkles, gray hair, or gravity.
Exactly. When you fully internalize that your physical body is just a temporary vehicle, a biological jacket you are wearing for the duration of this specific lifetime, your relationship to it changes completely.
You don't obsess over it.
You still take excellent care of the jacket, you feed it well, you exercise it, you keep it clean, but you do not have a massive existential crisis when the jacket gets a scuff mark or starts to fray at the edges. You gain immense, unparalleled psychological freedom.
I am tracking with this deeply. I can clearly see the immense psychological value in detaching from forms. But honestly, this realization actually leads me to a massive conceptual roadblock.
Let's hear it.
If everything is an illusion, if my body isn't my true self, if the Buddha says I shouldn't attach to the form of my charity, and I shouldn't attach to the form of my identity, how do we even function in society?
That is the big question.
How do we talk about or navigate the real world?
It is the ultimate paradox of language. If words are forms and concepts are forms, how do we use them to communicate without getting trapped by them?
Exactly. I mean, if I shouldn't cling to anything, do I just sit in a cave in total silence forever? How do I even order a cup of coffee if the coffee is just a temporary arrangement of conditions and I shouldn't attach to it?
Well, this brings us to what is perhaps the most brilliant structural feature of the Diamond Sutra. The text actually anticipates this exact paradox.
Oh, it does.
Yes. The Buddha does not just tell you to drop forms and leave you floating out in a void. He provides a rigorous logical formula for how to use forms safely in the conventional world.
Okay, this is what we can call the matrix code of the sutra.
Yes. Scholars often refer to it as the syllogism of emptiness. It is a three-part logical formula that the Buddha uses constantly, repeatedly, throughout the entire text to train the listener's mind.
So what does this all mean? What is the formula?
The structure is always exactly the same. A is not A, therefore it is called A, or in the phrasing of the translation, A, ji fei A, shi ming A.
A is not A, therefore it is called A. Okay, to a mind trained in Western Aristotelian logic, that sounds like pure contradictory nonsense.
This sounds like a riddle.
A is A. That is the fundamental law of identity. A tree is a tree. How can A be not A?
To translate this philosophical riddle into practical utility, we have to understand the concept of the false name.
The false name.
The Buddha is drawing a hard, bright line between language and reality. Words, concepts, and labels are just bridges. They are tools we invented. They are entirely empty of the reality they point to.
Right. So in the sutra, the Buddha applies this formula to his own teachings. He says, what is called the Dharma is not the Dharma, therefore it is called the Dharma.
Or he applies it to the universe itself. What is called a world is not a world, therefore it is called a world.
Let me offer an extensive analogy here to make sure I'm grasping the mechanics of this, because I really think it's the key to the whole text.
Go for it.
Let's use the experience of going to a restaurant. You sit down and you look at the menu. The word burger is printed in black ink on the paper.
Okay, let's trace the logic.
The printed word burger is not an actual burger. You cannot eat the menu.
No, you would still be hungry.
The ink on the page is completely empty of calories. It has no flavor. It provides zero nourishment. So in the ultimate sense, the word burger is not a burger.
Exactly. The map is not the territory. The label is entirely devoid of the physical reality of the food.
But T, if I am sitting at the table and I actually want the waiter to bring me the physical food from the kitchen so I don't starve, I must use the word.
You have to speak the language.
I cannot just sit there in silent, enlightened emptiness. I have to point at the menu and say to the waiter, I would like the burger. So burger is not a burger, but in order to function in the conventional reality of the restaurant, it must be called a burger.
That is a flawless, highly practical analogy for the syllogism of emptiness. It perfectly illustrates how to use the false name.
So you need the menu, but you don't eat it.
Right. You use the label to successfully navigate the conventional world, you order the food, you get the nourishment, but you never, ever mistake the label for the ultimate reality. You never try to literally eat the paper menu.
Okay, so how does this formula apply to our lives beyond ordering food? How does it alleviate our actual suffering?
It applies directly to our deepest identities and our greatest sources of stress. Let's return to the workplace, where so much of our modern identity is forged. Let's say your title is Vice President of Marketing.
Okay, let's run it through the code. Vice President is not Vice President, therefore it is called Vice President.
Let's unpack the mechanism of that.
It means my true fundamental identity is not actually Vice President. I am a complex, flowing, unconditioned human being, the Dharma body.
Yes.
Vice President is just a temporary label, a set of shifting conditions and responsibilities that the company has temporarily agreed to assign to me. It's ink on a business card. It's the menu.
Yes, exactly. Now consider what happens when you truly believe you are the vice president, when you mistake the map for the territory.
If I think I am the label, I suffer immensely. Because if the company downsizes and I lose the job, or if a colleague disrespects the title in a meeting, my ego feels like it is being literally murdered.
It feels like an existential threat.
I experience severe anxiety because my entire existence is tied to a fragile, temporary concept.
Because you are trying to eat the menu, you are trying to derive your actual existential nourishment and self-worth from a paper label.
But when I apply the formula A is not A, I realize the title is empty. I can hold it lightly.
You wear it loosely.
I can still perform the duties of the vice president brilliantly, using the non-doing and action we discussed. But I know that the title is just a false name. If I lose the job tomorrow, my true self is entirely unharmed because the label was never me to begin with.
And this formula is incredibly liberating because it works for every single concept that causes us pain. Success is not success, therefore it is called success.
So you strive for it, but you don't let it define your worth.
Right. Failure is not failure, therefore it is called failure. You learn from the mistake, but you don't become the failure.
What about our relationships with difficult people? Enemy is not enemy, therefore they are called an enemy.
That is perhaps the most transformative application of all. An enemy is just a temporary amalgamation of conditions. Perhaps their past trauma, their current ignorance and misunderstanding, or just the structural conflict at work.
They aren't evil incarnate.
They are not fundamentally, permanently, in their absolute essence, an enemy. When we stop clinging to these strict, rigid definitions, we gain immense psychological freedom. We can navigate the world of forms. We can resolve the conflict, set boundaries, operate in the restaurant without ever getting trapped by the menus.
I have to admit, tracing the logic of this, I am feeling a deep sense of clarity.
It's a powerful framework.
If I can surf the waves with non-doing, if I can give without invisible strings, if I can hold my identity lightly, using the A is not a formula, it feels like my life should be smooth sailing from here on out. The friction is gone.
Well, it is important to understand the reality of actually implementing this.
Right, because the Sutra doesn't end with a happily ever after fade to black. Which brings us to a crucial reality check in Chapter 16. I like to call this the dark side of enlightenment.
It is a profound, necessary warning for the practitioner. The Buddha anticipates the exact friction you will encounter when you try to change your psychological operating system.
The text issues a very specific and, frankly, quite discouraging warning here. It says that if you genuinely start practicing this deep wisdom, if you actually start living with a mind that clings to nothing, if you stop playing the game of transactional charity and ego validation, people might not applaud you.
They probably won't.
In fact, they might mock you, belittle you, or treat you poorly. The Sutra says you will be scorned and despised.
To the logical mind, it seems entirely counterintuitive.
Let me play the skeptic again here. If I am doing all this amazing deep spiritual work, if I am curing my burnout, being generous without demanding gratitude, and holding my ego lightly, shouldn't my life get instantly better?
You'd assume so.
Shouldn't people be drawn to my peaceful energy? Why are people laughing at me? Why is my boss still taking advantage of my unattached work?
This raises an important question, and addresses the fundamental mechanics of karma as understood in Mahayana Buddhist philosophy. The sutra offers a brilliant, deeply comforting psychological reframe on this exact scenario of facing worldly pushback.
Walk me through the mechanics of that reframe, because facing scorn for trying to be a better person sounds deeply unfair.
The Buddha explains that if you are mocked, scorned, or experience sudden hardship while earnestly seeking this deep wisdom, it is not a punishment. The universe is not rejecting your progress. Rather, it is a sign of accelerated karmic clearing.
How does that work?
Imagine that your past actions, born of ignorance over countless lifetimes, have accumulated a massive debt of heavy, dark karma. Normally, that karma would have slowly ripened, causing you immense, prolonged suffering in the future, perhaps lifetimes of pain, illness, or despair.
Like a terrible loan coming due.
Exactly. But because you are now engaging with the ultimate truth of emptiness, you are completely altering the trajectory of that karma.
So the scorn I face today is actually a condensed, diluted version of the suffering I was supposed to face much later.
Exactly. The text suggests that the intense psychological friction of the world reacting to your new, unattached state is the fire that burns away the old karma. You are experiencing the scorn now, but because you are meeting it with wisdom instead of reacting with anger, you are exhausting the karmic debt rapidly.
You are paying pennies on the dollar to clear the ledger.
That is a perfect financial metaphor for it. You are settling a massive existential bankruptcy for a fraction of the cost, precisely because you are no longer fueling the cycle with new egoic reactions.
Let's apply that mechanism to a daily annoyance. Let's say I'm driving, I'm practicing non-doing, and someone aggressively cuts me off in traffic and flips me off.
Happens all the time.
My normal egoic reaction is rage. I want to honk, I want to scream, I want to speed up and teach them a lesson.
Which would just generate new, heavy karma and flood your body with stress hormones.
But with this reframe, instead of getting angry, I could look at the situation and think, oh, fascinating. I just paid off a massive karmic debt, maybe a debt that would have caused me a severe illness or a major accident down the road. And all it cost me was being annoyed for 3 seconds in traffic. What an absolute bargain.
You are actively neutralizing the debt through the application of wisdom and patience. You are absorbing the blow. But because there is no rigid ego there to bruise, the blow passes right through you. And this brings us to the ultimate behavioral goal of the entire practice, which is awakening oneself and others.
The Chinese phrase for that is ziju tueta, right?
Yes. The true bodhisattva, the advanced practitioner of this deep wisdom, endures the scorn and the violence of the world with absolute, perfect patience. To illustrate just how far this patience can go, the sources recall a famous past life story of the Buddha that is referenced right in this section of the sutra.
It's an intense story. Set the scene for us.
In a previous life, the entity who would become the Buddha was a sage living deep in the forest, practicing perfect patience and meditation. A cruel, tyrannical ruler named King Kali came into the forest with his entourage. Through a series of events, the king flew into a jealous, completely unhinged rage against the sage.
And it gets brutal.
It does. The king literally drew his sword and dismembered the sage, hacking off his limbs one by one.
It is a horrific, visceral image to include in a text about mental peace.
It is extreme for a reason, because the text highlights the internal state of the sage during this violence. As his physical body was being brutally cut to pieces, the sage felt absolutely no anger, no hatred, and no resentment whatsoever toward the king.
How's that psychologically possible? I mean, really?
Because the sage had completely realized the emptiness of the three spheres, he had absolutely no attachment to the four marks. He did not hold the concept of an ego, a person, a being, or a life.
Let's run that through the matrix code we learned.
The sage realized that the scorner, the king, the scorned himself, and the act of scorning, the violence, were all fundamentally empty. They were just temporary, swirling forms. He knew that body is not body, therefore it is called body.
So he didn't identify with the flesh.
Right. Because he didn't cling to the form of his physical vehicle, and he didn't cling to the rigid concept of injustice, he suffered absolutely no psychological pain. His mind remained entirely free, even as the body was destroyed.
Now, obviously, the sutra is not instructing us to go out and let people physically assault us. This isn't about becoming a literal martyr in the modern world.
No, not at all.
It is an extreme, stylized metaphor for psychological resilience.
Precisely. It scales down to our everyday psychological dismemberments.
Right. When someone hacks off our pride in a meeting by brutally insulting our idea in front of the whole team, or when someone dismembers our reputation with workplace gossip.
Those are our daily battles.
Our normal reaction is to bleed emotional energy, to fight back, to suffer. But using this framework, we could just watch the illusion play out. We know the rule. The insult is not an insult, therefore it is called an insult. It's just sound waves in the air. It has no actual power over the Dharma body.
It is the ultimate armor. And the profound paradox is that by wearing no armor at all, by being completely empty of a rigid defensive ego, there's simply nothing for the world's arrows to strike. They just pass through the empty space.
That is a breathtaking architectural structure of thought. From the scale of the cosmos down to the interaction in the meeting room, it all connects so perfectly.
It is a complete, beautifully self-sustaining system for liberation.
So, let's synthesize this massive journey we have taken you, the listener, on today. We started by imagining a trillionaire giving away multiverses filled with solid diamonds, and we learned that grasping a simple 4-line stanza of truth is infinitely more valuable.
Yes.
Because material wealth feud merely decorates the golden cage of our suffering, while spiritual wisdom Gandhi gives us the key to walk right out.
We explored the mechanics of modern burnout, seeing how it is driven by attached giving and the invisible strings we attach to our favors. We learned that applying the emptiness of the 3 spheres allows us to give freely, meeting the needs of the moment without depleting our own egoic bank accounts.
We looked at how Jon Kabat-Zinn's clinical mindfulness helps us practice the Sutra's directive to cling to nothing. We learned how non-doing in action allows us to grab a surfboard and ride the chaotic waves of our jobs, engaging deeply with the work while entirely dropping our anxiety over the outcomes.
We tackled the modern epidemic of appearance anxiety by realizing that our physical forms are illusory, changing rivers. We learned to practice patient acquiescence to the aging process, identifying instead with our true nature, the unconditioned Dharma body.
We decoded the matrix of the Sutra. A is not A, therefore it is called A, learning the vital difference between the map and the territory. So we never again try to eat the paper menus of our job titles, our successes, or our failures.
Never eat the menu.
And finally, we learned that when the world pushes back, when we face friction and mockery for trying to grow, we are simply paying off our deep karmic debts at a steep, beautiful discount.
It is a profound psychological toolkit, and it all points back to one undeniable truth. True wealth isn't the diamonds. It isn't the galaxies of gold. True wealth is the mind that no longer desperately needs them. It is the deep, unshakable tranquility of understanding the famous final 4-line stanza of the Sutra. All conditioned phenomena are like a dream, an illusion, a bubble, a shadow, like dew or a flash of lightning. Thus we shall perceive them.
Which brings us to our final provocative challenge for you, the listener, as you step away from this deep dive and back out into the friction of the real world. The next time you do a favor for someone today, whether it's holding a heavy door for a stranger, helping a colleague with a tedious task, or giving a small gift to your partner, I want you to try a quiet internal experiment.
A practical, immediate application of the emptiness we discussed.
Exactly. As you're performing the action, try to conceptually erase the I, doing the favor, and erase the you, receiving it. Just for a split second, let the action of the giving exist purely on its own, floating in space. Notice how your underlying physical stress, that subtle, tight demand in your chest for a thank you or a validating smile, just vanishes when the transaction disappears. Notice what happens when you finally turn on the X-ray machine and see right through the illusion of your own ego. See you on the next deep dive.